Okay, let's get started. So we're going to cover reading charts critically, and some of the learning objectives that I want to emphasize is that, first of all, we're going to learn how to identify what a chart is actually showing versus what it appears to suggest, and distinguish between anecdote and data-supported patterns, recognize common ways charts can be misleading and incomplete. So in other words, what not to claim, what not to understand from the chart. It is important to understand and ask critical questions about what the data actually includes, what excludes, what it compares, what it actually tells us. Okay, so before we believe any chart, I wanted to ask these questions, okay? Especially about the inequality or some sensitive issues, the societal issues. It's tempting to just jump straight into the conclusion. Here's some kind of a simple framework, okay? So reading charts critically means slowing down. Slow down and ask those questions. First of all, who collected the data? Like literally, who collected the data? Is it like a credible source? Where did the data come from? What exactly is being measured? What is missing? What comparison is implied? And what conclusions would be wrong to make? Okay, who collected the data? Was it a government agency, a company, a nonprofit, a research group, a potentially biased nonprofit, for example, right? What exactly is being measured? Not exactly what you think it measures, but exactly what the chart literally measures. And third, what's missing? It's very important to identify and being aware. Know that data captures everything. So, right, like we know that there will be missing variables. We're living in an imperfect world. And the fourth one is compare what comparisons is implied. Who is being compared to whom? What is being treated as the baseline? It is very important. And finally, notice what conclusions feels obvious, right? And then you ask yourself, does the chart actually support that conclusion? And that pause between jumping into the conclusion and seeing what the chart actually tells you is what the critical reading, like this visual literacy actually looks like. So it's very important. Okay. What happens if you don't read charts critically? First of all, it is very easy to oversimplify complex problems and reinforce stereotypes or blame individuals or blame the system, right? Especially if we're talking about the gender related issues, the women in math, science, and engineering. Understanding the charts wrong, and if we don't read it critically, then it may lead to ineffective policies, the harmful policies even, and it would make real inequalities that actually appear in our system, in the society, appear like a solved issue, or like, okay, like it is no longer a systemic problem, or it may look like natural, but in fact those inequalities actually appear, and it may actually shut down the productive discussion. So these are important to be aware of, why we may need to understand these charts actually critically and apply the critical thinking. So in this video, we'll practice how to read the charts from credible sources critically, not necessarily just like merely accepting them, but asking better questions. Okay, so let's do some practice for critical thinking and reading charts. Let's start with the first one. This is the kind of the screenshot from the US Census Bureau. I put the source. If you want to check that out, you can take a look. It's titled, as you can see, gender pay gap similar among certificate degree graduates and those from highly selective bachelor's degree, top rated schools. Okay, let's begin. Uh-oh. All right. Okay. Let's start by reading this chart without jumping into conclusions. So first of all, this is the bar plot. What bar plots are used for is comparing magnitudes and across categories, showing differences between groups, and also highlight the relative size. Okay, so in this case, it's used to compare the two categories. So what are the two categories? The earning gap due to gender by 2 education levels, the certificate and the bachelor degree from top-rated schools. So this figure compares women's average earnings to men's average earnings between these years. What is it, 2005 and 2019, within the same education level. So for every dollar earned by men, women with a certificate, the first bar, earned 71.2 cents, and women with a bachelor's degree from a top-rated school earned 71.6 cents. So in this chart, we see that the men's earnings are implicitly traded as a reference point, right? So if earnings were equal, we would expect the women's earning to be also at the $1. So it's like old bar would be full, right? But in this case, it's not. So that means that the earning gap is roughly like 28-29% in both cases, in the certificate and the top-rated bachelor degree school graduation, right? So the key takeaway here is not exact sense. Like, it doesn't really matter that much if it's like 71.2 versus 71.3, right? There is a pattern that we must see. The size of the earning gap is remarkably consistent across education levels. Can we say that? So we can pause here and then let that sink in, right? So let's ask the first question. First of all, who collected the data? Okay, that this data comes from the U.S. Census Bureau, and which is widely considered as a credible source. Okay, but of course, just because something is credible, it doesn't mean that we can't question it, right? Doesn't mean that it's unquestionable. Credibility tells us that the data is carefully collected. It doesn't tell us if it's complete, but it tells us it's carefully collected with the rigorous researchers. They actually carefully store the data, analyze the data. And what is actually being measured, let's ask the second question, is that this chart measures average earnings of graduates, right? It compares women and men within the same education category, but not within the same roles. So we don't know the job occupation distributions. Okay, it's good to know. So what is missing, right? As we said, every chart actually communicates an information, but as a nature of encapsulating something, right? Like collapsing into context, it is inevitably going to dismiss or miss some variables or hide some variables. Maybe not in a manipulative sense, but it's not going to communicate that variable. So notice what you don't see here. So you don't see the occupation or industry. So maybe it's not relevant to the research question that they want to communicate here. We don't see what else, the career stages, geographic differences, or full-time versus part-time maybe. That's all good. We just need to be aware what is not measuring. Not every chart is responsible for explaining everything, and charts are usually designed to answer one specific question, not all possible questions, okay? That's not the point of the chart. And this chart shows that the gap exists, and period, right? And why it exists. Okay, so what kind of comparisons imply? So the implied comparison is that if women get more education, even in elite education, right, like top-rated bachelor's degree, the gap should shrink. That's what we are expecting. That's kind of the implied assumption. But the gap barely changes. So then we can conclude that average earnings, when we compare the average earnings of women and men within the same education levels, we see that the change actually is barely happening, right? It is not trying to explain the causes of the gap, though. If the goal is to compare the education levels, then yes, the chart does that. But many readers will implicitly conclude something like education doesn't have women, maybe, or the gap is inevitable. So these are overclaims. So just by looking at the chart, we can't conclude those. We can't say education doesn't help women. We can't say that education doesn't help the closing the gap. And those conclusions go beyond what the chart actually supports. Okay, let's look at another one. Okay, let's look at this one. This is another bar chart, like our earlier ones. But now the comparison is a little more detailed, right? So we have the certificate and the bachelor's degree, but now with the children and without children. So let's talk about why bar plots work. So first of all, human mind is wired to see and compare the lengths. Okay, humans are very good at comparing the lengths of things. And bar plots are good for comparing the length, right? But it's not good for showing distributions. We're not showing any distribution. We're not showing any causality. And it shows, in this case, women's earnings relative to men's earning, right? So we have, again, the $1 of male earning as the reference point. And how does this gap changes by the education level and the parental status. So now we added another variable, okay? And the chart sets men's earning at the $1 as the reference point, which is fine, but we just need to be aware, right? What's the baseline? And it then shows how much women earn per dollar earned by men, broken down by education and whether women have children. And if we were to just read what is written on the bar, we can see, okay, if a woman with the children and has a certificate, there's a 55.9 cents per $1 earned by men. And without children, this increases to 89.1 cents. If it's a bachelor's degree, if they have a bachelor's degree and if they have children, then it's 47%, and without children, 47 cents, and without the children, it is 80.1 cents. So this chart shows that women with children earn substantially less relative to men than women without children across education levels. So this may suggest that the parental status is strongly associated with gender earning gaps, even though it's very important that the chart doesn't establish why these differences occur. The differences are so large, and it's very tempting to jump straight to conclusions, but the patterns don't automatically mean simple causes. Okay, so let's look at the wrong way of reading this chart. One possible misconception that you should be aware of if you're reading this critically and applying critical thinking into this chart is that having children causes women to earn less. That's a very immediate possible misconception. Or why people jump to this, if we were to understand, because the gap is dramatically larger for women with children, and the visual contrast is striking, right? So we see the without children and the with children, there's a huge gap. But this kind of a misconception, it is a misconception, and it is a wrong conclusion, because this chart is descriptive. It's not causal. Understand the difference. This is a descriptive. It just describes the situation. It doesn't control for maybe hours worked or the maybe part-time, full-time situations. We don't know the causal relationship. We just know there's an association, okay? It's important to understand the difference. Another misconception is women choose to earn less once they have children. Well, we don't know that causal relationship. People usually jump to that kind of a conclusion because of cultural narratives, there are stereotypes. Maybe you have an anecdote from a family member who choose to change career once they have a kid, but that anecdote doesn't generalize. But because of the cultural narratives or personal anecdotes, you may think, or one may think, just by looking at this chart, that it is actually because women choose to earn less, or they choose the careers that pay less once they have children. But it's not necessarily, at least from this chart, we don't know that information, right? So this is wrong because this chart shows outcomes. It doesn't show us choices that women make, or it's not a longitudinal study. We don't know. Another misconception is that men are unaffected by parenthood. Well, we don't know, but it's a very common misconception, right? So people tend to jump to this conclusion because the chart only breaks down women by parental status and men are treated as a single reference group. But this is wrong because what we don't see is the men with children versus men without children, right? Or whether fatherhood affects men's earnings. So we don't know these facts, so it's important not to overclaim because even what you see is consistent with the narrative that you want to communicate. If you overclaim, that weakens your argument. So it's important to tell the story that only your data tells, okay? And another misconception, education should protect women from parenthood penalties, and since it doesn't, education is useless. That's another misconception that I hear a lot. And it is also very easy for people to jump to this kind of a conclusion because we see that the very large gap at higher education levels and expectations that education solves inequality. But this is wrong because the chart simply doesn't show that. It doesn't show earnings before parenthood and earnings after parenthood. It doesn't tell us the career trajectories over time. And first of all, it doesn't apply to every woman. It's important to understand that. But people also jump to that conclusion. So population level data doesn't predict the individual outcomes. It's very important to point out too. Another misconception is that this proves discrimination. Look at this chart and there is a gender discrimination. Of course people jump to this conclusion because it just pattern feels unfair. It just evokes some emotions. It looks so unfair. But when we see a large and consistent gaps across education levels like this one, that raises a legitimate question about the structural dynamics, systemic forces, the structural barriers. But the evidence that is consistent with the discrimination is not the same as the evidence that isolates the description as the cause. We don't see isolated discrimination as a cause. We don't have a causal claim here, okay? So we can say this clearly and confidently that there is a pattern that we see, and a pattern like this, exactly what we would expect to see if there's a systemic discrimination we're operating. Well, we can't prove the discrimination with this chart. But to prove the discrimination, we need to rule out alternative explanations. So that is crucial in critical thinking. If you're making a claim, you need to be ruling out alternative explanations, and this chart clearly doesn't allow us to do so. Okay, specifically this chart doesn't isolate the employer pay setting behavior, promotion decisions, the institutional policies, discrimination. And also it's unfair to boil down or just tell this chart proves discrimination, because discrimination is a mechanism, it's a systemic issue. This chart just shows the outcomes. So it's almost like you see your neighbor in your neighborhood, and she or he is like consistently worsening their health. You see like every day their health outcomes are degrading. That's a strong evidence that there's a systemic problem, right? So you know that there's something wrong with your neighbor, but we still wouldn't be able to say that what the exact cause. Maybe they're going through a stressful time. There's a pollution. Maybe they, I don't know, work related. Maybe they lost a family member, something, right? Without a more targeted evidence, we can observe the pattern, but we can't point out just by looking at their appearance. We can't say, oh, their health is worsening because of these reasons. Okay, so this chart suggests a structural issue, but it doesn't isolate which mechanism is responsible. Okay, it suggests something, but it doesn't tells us why exactly this is happening. And of course, there's a real risk of jumping to a conclusion too fast. And if we label the pattern as proof of discrimination very quickly, maybe too quickly, we actually weaken our argument, and critiques can point to missing controls, the claim becomes vulnerable, we are actually doing a disservice to us. The conversation shuts down instead of like deepening and becoming more productive. People say, no, no, no. It's like, no, there's not a discrimination. You're just overclaiming from this chart. It is really unproductive. So it's important to understand what this chart is actually about. Okay, we're going to move on to another type of chart, which is the pie chart. Let's meet in the next video.